I'm really especially grateful for this invitation to speak to the Spark community. I've had a long career exploring language in autism. And today what I'm going to do is to present just a few highlights of some of our current and future work, and hope that at the end we'll have time for questions that may open up the discussion in a broader way. So here's the roadmap of what I'm hoping to accomplish in the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to start by talking about the complexity of language and communication. I'll then give a brief overview of what we understand about the variability of language in autism. And then the two main portions of my talk will focus first on early signs and predictors of language and variability. And then I'll move into talking about minimally verbal autism. And included here at the end, I will focus on some explanations that we've been exploring about why minimally verbal children fail to acquire spoken language. And we'll finish up with some takeaways from the talk. So let me start by talking about the complexity of language. This is truly the most remarkable human achievement. And this is what I wanted to study throughout my career, but certainly as I was entering graduate school. So let's start off by just looking at this little scenario. We have a couple talking over a table. Okay.
Excuse me, Dr. Flusberg, sorry to interrupt, but would you mind switching your presentation into full screen view? You're currently in presenter view.
Sorry.
That's okay. A couple of our attendees actually flagged it for us, so thank you so much.
All right, well, how do I get out of here? How about this? Is that better?
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's go back to this couple talking across a table. This is kind of what my husband and I look like every morning at breakfast when we finally get there. So the language that we're speaking, the linguistic code that we're effortlessly using, the speech sounds, the vocabulary, the grammar to formulate sentences. And we go back and forth exchanging our ideas, or perhaps more realistically arguing about who's taking care of dinner this evening. That's all very simple, the back and forth. This is much more complex to think about the sounds, the words, and the grammar of language. But of course, genuine communication involves so much more. It really encompasses and draws on all our capacities, our sensory capacities, our cognitive abilities, motor systems, memory, planning, social and emotional understanding. That's what genuine language and communication is all about. And then, of course, we have to think about the processes, the speaker and the listener, and all the different parts of the brain that are involved. And highlighted on this illustration are just those regions of brain that are particularly involved in both speech perception and speech production. And you can see this is taking up almost half the cortical areas, even though the rest of the brain is also going to be involved when we're engaging in conversation with other people. And finally, we need to think about the pathways that connect all these different brain regions. This is really what allows language to be processed in such an effortless way. What we have to think about, what is so remarkable, is that most, but of course not all, children begin this pathway fairly soon after they are born. They're even actually listening to language before they're born. But by the time they're 3 years old, they've pretty much mastered much of this system. So it's really a remarkable development. But when we think about autism, of course, there we begin to see how things break down. So let's turn to talk about language and communication in autism. In DSM-5, while social communication is a core impairment, language impairment is a co-occurring condition, along with perhaps intellectual disability, but not always, medical problems, as well as genetic and other behavioral issues. Those are all different co-occurring conditions. So language and communication in autism involves core and universal impairments in social communication, but the co-occurring impairments are in the linguistic code. And here is where we see enormous heterogeneity in outcome, going from people who remain completely nonverbal to those who have superior linguistic skills alongside social communication impairments. And of course, there's everything in between. So if we look at a pie chart, about a quarter may have no language impairment, about just under a half do acquire spoken language, but they may have some impairments, particularly in more complex aspects of grammar. And then about a third remain minimally or nonverbal. So why is language so important? First and foremost, this is the key way in which we connect with other people. It is our social glue, both in person and remotely. It's a way of getting to know people. This is how we understand other people's minds. We share our thoughts, our feelings, our aspirations through language. It becomes, once language is acquired, the primary tool for learning. It's critical for self-regulation and for self-reflecting. So it's not just getting to know other people, but through language, we also get to know ourselves. And perhaps most important, in thinking about autism, language is the single best predictor of future long-term outcomes. So let me turn now and talk to you about a line of work that I have been focusing on for the last 15 years or so, and that is to think about what might be some of the earliest signs and predictors of this enormous variability in language outcomes among children with autism. So to do so, we study infants, and here you see a photo of my main collaborator on this research program, Professor Charles Nelson from Harvard University. And here what we do is we're studying infants who are at higher risk. For the most part, we've been studying infants who have an older sibling with autism. About 1 in 5 of these babies we know will later be diagnosed with autism. And we compare them to lower risk infants, infants who don't come from a family history that includes autism. And we followed our babies from soon after birth to about the age of 3, at which point we can firmly come to some sort of diagnostic outcome. Do these children have autism? Do they have language delays? Or do they have other outcomes? For the most part, they will have a typical outcome. And I'll refer to this group as the 80%, in contrast to the 20% with the autism outcome. And what we're doing is we're exploring behavioral and brain development to predict these 3-year-old outcomes, and doing so in this prospective longitudinal design. So let me start by talking about what do parents tell us about the concerns that they have at 12 months. And remember, 12 months is long before autism symptoms emerge and can be identified. But of course, parents express their worries to us. So here's what we found from an early study that we did. And what you can see here is we divided the concerns, the behavioral concerns that parents expressed, into the social communication worries like eye contact or joint attention, repetitive behaviors or sensory concerns on the right, and on the left, a separate category for language, because so many parents mentioned language. And in red, you can see the parents of the babies at 12 months who later, 2 years later, will be diagnosed with autism. And you see here that 60% almost express concerns about their infant's language, far more so than the other groups of parents. In green, you see the parents of high-risk babies, but they're the 80% who don't end up with autism. And in blue, we have the low-risk controls. So is there any truth to their concerns? The answer is yes. When we saw these babies in the lab at 12 months, we picked up, we just measured how much do the babies vocalize when they're interacting with their parents, when they're interacting with the examiners. We just measured that. And you can see on this graph that the group in red, the ones who were later diagnosed with autism, vocalized significantly less than any of the other babies. Well, now let's turn to exploring whether we can pick up differences in how these babies' brains respond to speech during the first year of life. And to do so, we use electrophysiology, and you can see here are our babies and toddlers wearing the cap, which is very easy and comfortable for babies to acclimate to, and it only takes about a few minutes to get them wired up, so to speak. And to look at their brain responses, we have the babies sitting on their mom's lap, as you can see here, and they're listening to different speech sounds, da, ta, da, and just there in the background, and the baby can look at the examiner blowing bubbles or at a screensaver, trying to keep as still as possible. And we look at how the brains are responding to speech. And here what I'm going to talk about, we've looked at many different aspects of this, but I'm going to look first of all at the brain asymmetry. What we know is that in almost all people, the left half of the brain responds just a little bit faster to language than the right half of the brain, and it's more specialized for processing complex aspects of language. And we wanted to know, how early does this emerge? And will we see differences in this left hemisphere asymmetry, if you will, in our different groups of babies? And what we found was that certainly by 9 months, but especially at 12 months, we saw significant differences in asymmetry in the infants who were later diagnosed with autism. You can see this data here. On the left, we have our low-risk babies, and they're showing a decided left hemisphere advantage. In the middle, we have our 80% of high-risk babies who are different from the low-risk babies, but they're showing equal response in both the left and the right hemispheres. And finally, on the right, we see the infants who 2 years later will be diagnosed with autism. And we see here that they're showing a reversed asymmetry. So very early on, long before autism is diagnosed in these infants, we see that their brains are processing language differently. And this is true both for the babies whose language ends up being within the normal range, as well as for those who have more significant language impairments. We then wanted to know about the functional connectivity, how well connected are the language regions of the brain. You can see here in this schematic, there's critical language area in the front half of the brain called Broca's area, and in the back part of the brain called Wernicke's area, and that green line here, which is the primary connecting pathway. So from that same speech task, we measured how connected were the signals, the brain signals, how synchronous were the brain signals between the front and the posterior regions using these specific electrodes. And what we found is shown here at 12 months. At 12 months, we see that the infants in red, those are the high risk who end up with an autism diagnosis, have the lowest functional connectivity between those frontal and posterior brain regions. What I will say is that both for the asymmetry and functional connectivity, there are no differences that we see between our groups of infants. Differences begin to emerge at 9 months, and then we see them here at 12 months. So we're seeing that the brains are responding differently to language in these ways very early in development. I want to turn now to another study that we did. Actually, before we started to study babies, we studied a very large group of toddlers who had already been diagnosed with autism. And we were interested in looking at what predicts the variability of language in this group of 160 toddlers. And on the right here, you can see the graph of their Mullen language scores, where 100, this red bar, is exactly average. And you can see a small number of our toddlers are even above average or within the average range. But the language varies enormously. This is 100, each dot here is one of those 160 toddlers. But there's also this large group who are very significantly impaired in language. And we wanted to know what might predict this kind of variability. And we looked at motor skills. Yes, that predicts variability. Initiating joint attention. Yes, that too predicts. Responding to joint attention. Yes, that predicts. Play skills. Yes, that predicts. Imitation. That too predicts. Cognition and IQ. That predicts language. And finally, gestural communication, an important precursor to language. All of these behavioral measures that we had on these toddlers predicted their language scores. Each of them was related, but it was gesture that was the single most significant predictor, perhaps because it incorporates so many of these other aspects of behavior and is most closely related to language itself. Okay, I want to turn now to talk about this 1/3 of the population who, beyond the toddler years, still have not acquired language. And this is a topic that we have now been focusing on for the last decade or so in my lab. This is the group that has been called very presciently, I think, the forgotten end of the spectrum. They are, despite intervention, they still have little spoken language, perhaps 20 to 30 words or brief phrases, although there's still considerable debate about how to define and who to include in this group. Importantly, what we see is that language is not used consistently. Sometimes the individual, the child or adolescent, will be able to speak a fair amount, and other times they just don't use language to communicate with others. Often, these individuals are the most severely impaired, not only with autism severity, but also with numerous other co-occurring conditions. And I think one of the reasons researchers like me and others had neglected them for so long is that they are difficult to evaluate. And I think we certainly were always concerned about what measures might we effectively use to evaluate them. So we've been looking into this, and today what I'm going to do is tell you just a little bit about the language measures that we've been trying to develop that would be really suitable for assessing both receptive and expressive language in this population. So we have 3 different types of language measures that are generally used: standardized tests that are administered by a trained clinician or examiner, parent report questions or interviews where parents tell us about their child's language ability, and naturalistic assessment, in particular using natural language samples, those conversations across the table, perhaps, for assessing especially expressive language. And all of these are important and used in a variety of different ways and may complement one another. But there are real challenges in what's out there right now in effectively picking up and assessing accurately receptive and expressive language in minimally verbal. What you see here is based on a sample of about 100 children and adolescents that we had seen. On the right, we see the expressive vocabulary as reported by parents. And you can see most of the children had very few words, which is what we expect, since that's how we recruited this sample. But in contrast, we see that their receptive vocabulary is far more varied, and in general, receptive knowledge is higher than expressive. But we're never sure how well we're capturing their receptive knowledge. And standardized tests and measures aren't always suitable. So in this initial study, what we did was to look at whether novel methods could be useful. We had 2 standard measures: the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, where you show a page with 4 photos and you ask the child to point to the picture of yawning. If you look at this picture, this array here, a parent report word list that we adapted to be more suitable for older children. And we investigated 2 different novel methods. One was eye tracking, where you show on a computer display that's equipped with an eye tracker 2 photos side by side, and you say the word dog. And those green dots show us that the child is fixating more on the picture of the dog than they are of the contrasting picture of the bird. And we also used touchscreen. We did this quite a while ago, so we had old school touchscreen computer methods. And again, we see the child is able to point directly to touch the photo, which we thought may be somewhat more amenable for assessment than the pointing on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And indeed, we found that both our novel methods were very effective. And as we see, these very high numbers show that they correlate highly with Peabody scores in those children on whom we could administer the Peabody. And just this week, earlier this week, a paper was published in the journal Autism by a group showing that more minimally verbal children do better, their performance is better, higher with a touch screen. In this case, they used an iPad than on the standard PPVT. So I think the future needs to take into consideration how we might deploy new technologies that would provide us with more valid assessment methods. Let me talk now about the work that we've been doing on developing a standardized protocol for collecting natural language samples from children and adolescents with autism. And we call our measure ELSA. This is our website. Everything about ELSA is available all the information you need is available on the website that I've listed here. And what ELSA consists of? ELSA A is for older children and adolescents. We also have the T version for toddlers, but it consists of a number of different activities. We're aiming to collect a 20 to 25-minute language sample of the examiner interacting with the child. And we found that having lots of different activities really optimized. It gave us opportunities for collecting different types of words and more words and conversations, and kept the kids engaged. We then went on to ask, after we developed and showed that we were able to collect wonderful language samples, we then wanted to say, well, what about parents? We know we can do this. Could parents do this? And if parents could do this, is it better or is it worse? And by better or worse, I mean, do they elicit more language and different language from their children than examiners who, of course, don't know them? So the examiners collected a sample from a group of children in the lab, and then the parents did the same in the home. We sent them off with all the information about how to do this. And our main measures were frequency of utterances. How often did they use a speech utterance? How many words? And conversational turns, which is a key measure of conversational interaction or social communication. And what we found was that across all our measures, the parents themselves used twice as much language approximately as the examiner in the same amount of time. And then when we looked at, well, what did the children produce? Again, we found children talked twice as much and used more different words when they were with their parents in the home than with their examiner. This, I think, is very exciting and sends us off in new directions for thinking about how we might assess language. More recently, we've been looking at parent-child interactions in a different way in the home. And this was essentially brought about by COVID, where we could no longer see children in the lab. So last year, we launched a new project, and we ran this project entirely through Spark Research Match. So if any of our parents are out there listening to this webinar, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for participating. And we recruited in the end 100 families. We more than met our goal, children between the ages of 4 and 7 years old. And the children varied in language, although we did emphasize that we were looking for parents, for children who were minimally verbal. And the focus of this project was on speech and language and its relationship to motor functioning. And because we are doing this with Spark and the broader research program, POLO, to which this is attached, has a genetic component to it, we are able to take the DNA samples that you have submitted through Spark, and we are going to be able, with our collaborators at UCLA, under the leadership of Dan Geschwin there, to investigate links between DNA and the speech and language and motor measures that we collected in the home. So I'm just going to give you a tiny snippet because we're just beginning to look at our data. We collected a parent-child interaction using Zoom for about 15 minutes, and we asked parents just to engage in a couple of activities. They could choose whatever they wanted to do, and that we were collecting their interaction. And here are some of the photos of our families, and you can see they're doing many different things. And just to give you a brief look at the data, what you can see in the graph that I'm showing here is we have many different activities, from snack all the way down to coloring and art with figure play and screen time and sensory. And we looked to see, how did this vary with the child's language? The children up here have more language. The children down here have less language. They're lower in their language abilities. And you can see that, in fact, it didn't vary so much across language abilities. There are some differences here and some differences here, but by and large, we saw pretty parallel activities. Where we did see differences is that the children with the lowest language, those parents brought out many more different activities, in a way reflecting exactly the way we had designed ELSA to keep these children engaged and active, and to be able to explore a wider range of language using more activities within a given period of time. Okay, I want to go in now to the last part of my talk, and I'm going to have to do this very quickly since we are behind time, is to ask, why don't they speak? There are many potential explanations, some of which I'll talk about, but many more that I think we still need to discover. And I want to emphasize now, in any one child, we might see any or all of these explanations for why they don't speak. It is enormously variable. They are, every minimally verbal individual is as unique as the next. So in our first study, we looked at behavioral predictors, reflecting what we had done many years ago with the toddlers. We then also looked at speech motor impairments because we thought this, well, we sort of knew from the literature and knowing our kids, this was a critical domain. And then finally, we also looked at auditory processing. We were especially interested in whether this would be related to receptive language. So in looking at expressive language, there's some variability within this population, and we looked at the same behavioral predictors as before, only this time we found that joint attention was not a significant predictor for these older minimally verbal children. Play, imitation, and cognitive level were, and of these, imitation was the single best predictor. So a somewhat different pattern than we saw with our toddlers. In looking at speech motor impairments, we were particularly interested in whether some of our minimally verbal children would have a comorbid disorder of childhood apraxia of speech. And this is a rare neurological disorder that you see with and without autism, we now know, that involves impairments in speech movement, precision, and consistency. And what we found was that in a group of almost 60 children, there was a very high rate, about a quarter of these children met criteria for childhood apraxia of speech based on expert clinical judgment. And in fact, over 75% of this group of children had some sort of speech and motor disorder, some not quite meeting criteria for CAS, but maybe another speech disorder, and about a quarter who was nonverbal. And so you couldn't even tell, you couldn't even assess whether they had CAS. So that seems to be significant. Finally, let me talk about auditory processing. We're particularly interested in the fact that anecdotally, we see a lot of auditory sensory behaviors like covering your ears among children and adolescents who are minimally verbal. So the first thing we did was to code in naturalistic situations, how much time did the individual child or adolescent spend engaged in atypical sensory behavior. And this was based on observation. And in blue, you see verbally fluent children with autism, and in red, the minimally and low verbal. And what you can see is that they're about the same on visual sensory behaviors, but we see far more time spent in auditory sensory behaviors. And we found that receptive language was lower in those children who showed the most, who were engaged in the most sensory, the most auditory behaviors. So we see that indeed it is correlated with this. And finally, we wanted to know, is there a brain marker for these auditory processing problems in minimally and low verbal? We did this with adolescents, and we used our same EEG setup as we have with our babies. And here what we're looking at is how the brain responds to a different tone, what we call a deviant tone. They're listening to a tone repeatedly over time at a particular frequency, a particular loudness in this case, and then very occasionally there'd be a sound that was either louder or softer. We call that the deviant sound. And we saw that, in fact, the amplitude, that's this peak here, where that peak was smaller in those adolescents who had more auditory sensory behaviors, and that's illustrated in this graph here. So let's move into the takeaways. The time has passed so quickly. What can we conclude? I think acquiring language and communication is not only a critical goal for children with autism. In my view, it is the critical goal. Many factors predict which young children will and won't make progress, and we see differences both in behavior as well as in brain functioning. Interventions should target those behaviors that are key for each child. I think we've made an awful lot of progress in developmental behavioral interventions that are targeting the kinds of problems or predictors that we talked about earlier. Takeaways 2. Despite every effort, there are children who don't acquire spoken language. There's many explanations. And as I said before, they're going to be unique and in combination with one another, and others that we have not even begun to explore that are important. Targeted interventions can make a difference beyond the age of 5, including use of augmentative and alternative communication needs. But we still know so little about this, and we need to focus far more research into this area in the future. So I just have time very briefly to thank all my collaborators. There's a picture from my lab, our first unmasked get together. Nowadays we mask again all the time. Collaborators at CARE and elsewhere. I want to thank you all for listening. I'm especially grateful to our funders who make all of this possible, and particularly a very special thanks to all the families and the children who've given us their time and support, and from whom I have learned so much over the years. Thank you. Time for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to everyone for submitting your questions. We've received a number of questions, and we'll get to a few of them live, but we will plan to organize a follow-up Q&A to answer some more of these on the website. But for now, we'll start with some of the questions that we saw quite a few inquiries about. So starting with, can you talk a little bit about the difference between speech and language, and as a caveat to that, can you have language and be nonverbal?
Okay, that's a terrific question. And I should have defined my terms more in a more focused way at the beginning. I mean, I think people do use speech and language somewhat interchangeably, but they are, as you point out, distinct constructs. Language is an abstract system that consists of the rules for combining the minimal units that at least for speech, are speech sounds. But if we think about signs, there are minimal units that are used in sign language. And sign language is every bit a language as spoken language is. Okay, and we have the minimal units in speech. Those are the phonemes, like the consonants and vowels. And so when I use speech, I'm talking about that aspect. And then I think about spoken language. All our work has focused on spoken language in this population. That's what we've been interested in. Language is an abstract system, and most definitely you can have language without being able to speak. And we know of so many examples, people who had speech, but then lost it as a result of neurodegenerative disease. And also within the autistic population, we know that there are people who don't acquire spoken language, but they are certainly able to communicate to some degree using some alternative means. And for some, that may be sign language. For more, I think the majority, it'll be something like picture exchange. We're pointing to pictures. That's communication, okay? Being able to say what you want by choosing a picture that matches what you're interested in. A speech generating device. Those, I think, are so promising and so useful and have become way more usable now than they were 10, 15 years ago. And then we also have a few who do learn to type independently. They do have literacy skills, demonstrated literacy skills, and may be able to type using some keyboard or other. Okay.
Great, thank you. Another topic that we had a few inquiries about was regression. So specifically, can you speak to some examples of signs of language regression, and if possible, anything that you can speak to that might cause this sort of regression?
Okay, so again, it's a really interesting subject, and it was something I was really interested to see in the infants that we would follow prospectively, because of course, for the most part, we know that a child's regressed because a parent tells us this, that they had a child who at 12 months was speaking, and then by the time they were 18 months, they were no longer speaking. Interestingly, we have not seen a single example, despite, I mean, we haven't got a huge sample, but even across the Baby Sibling Research Consortium, which is a collaborative of research groups going, we see much less regression than is reported in the literature. That is not to say it doesn't exist. That is to say we are studying a special group of kids, okay? These parents are hypervigilant. They're enrolled in a study. For us, when we see signs of concern, even as early as 12 months, many of our kids end up in early intervention long before they reach the 3-year-old point of diagnostic outcome. So we weren't really able to sort of capture it prospectively. But what we do know from these studies, these longitudinal studies of infants, is that it is during the 2nd year of life that we see that their social engagement declines. We see a reduction in making eye contact. We see a reduction in directed social smiling, and we see a plateau or a reduction in vocalization, a failure to make progress. And so it seems, and this is mostly the beautiful work by Sally Ozanoff and her colleagues at UC Davis. And so we now think of the onset of autism is altogether, in terms of social communication, a form of regression. So it's not just loss of language, but it's a loss of social engagement over primarily that second year of life. And I think that's where regression fits in. Regression in language. It's part of that loss of social connectedness.
Great, thank you. You spoke a lot about some different language assessments that can be done. So how would you do a language assessment for someone who cannot stay on task?
Oh, well, you bring them back many times. You are patient. You don't sit there and barrel through the test the way you would with an ideal robot child, okay? Someone who is having trouble sitting through the assessment, you try to make it as enticing as possible. You pick an optimal time. I mean, we wrote a paper that discussed all the different ways in which you can carry out assessments with this population. You know, we learned over time, we use a lot of behavioral techniques, and we provide a lot of supports, and we have just a wonderful team of extremely well-trained people. And that is true for all my colleagues out there who are studying these kids. And you try and choose your assessment tools carefully. About a decade ago, we wrote a paper on what you might choose, what would be better to use than other assessment tools that are out there. It probably, I hope, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, we'd be able to revise that because new methods will have come on board, taking advantage of technology rather than paper and pencil. But what I would say is this: not every child enjoys the technology. And I think we just have to, you know, I know you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Yes, but here I'm talking about from a clinical perspective, really trying to maximize. And just because child, you know, is not gonna, it just seems unresponsive on one kind of an assessment, how can you change that? I think there's such a lot that we can do here. You know, one of my dreams that I'm never going to get around to doing, but I hope somebody one day does, is, you know, develop assessments that where you'd be able to embed it in the child's favored activity, their affinity, as Ron Suskind calls it. So if you love Disney characters, like Ron Suskind's kid loves, what you should do is embed your receptive language assessment into Disney characters. So you have them on the page. That's going to keep them occupied. I think we should always come to meet the child, and doing so would make it so much more fun, not just for the child, but also for the examiner, whether they're a clinician or a researcher. And I think we're getting closer to being able to do that more rapidly. But that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. The spaceship lover would have all their assessments, you know, with the spaceship motif. So I think those affinities really make a difference. And my colleague, John Gabrielli at MIT, has some beautiful research showing that the language regions in the brain light up, if you will, significantly brighter when the person with autism is listening to stories that's about their favorite affinity, this is what they love in life, than when they are listening to just kind of more neutral stories. So we know that we can engage the brain more, as well as the heart, if we meet the child where their interests and passions lie.
Great, thank you. And we'll just do one last quick question, another common question that came in about if you could give some examples of auditory sensory behaviors you observed in minimally verbal children.
Okay, so things like, I mean, the most obvious, they cover their ears. And it's so funny because you know, we sit around and talk about these behaviors. And I like to call them behaviors because I don't know, is the child covering their ears because they want to keep out the sounds? For some, actually, it looks like they like the way things sound. You know, you alter the sound when you cover the ear and wag them back and forth. Going out of the room when they hear a noise, getting distressed if there's more background noise, seeming more distracted when there's a change in the background noise. And just those kinds of things. I can't remember the complete list. You could look at our paper on this. That probably just has a complete listing of them. But I'm actually sure you parents out there who have children with auditory sensitivities know exactly what I'm talking about. And for some, it's so severe that they're most only comfortable when they're wearing headphones and being able to keep out too much external sound.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tager-Flusberg. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's webinar. As I mentioned before, we've received a boatload of wonderful questions from all of you, and we thank you. And we will plan to put together a Q&A with Dr. Tager-Flusberg for the website. So we'll hopefully get many more of your questions answered.